Just giving everyone a second to join. Um, but it is good to see so many of you here, and I am excited to introduce today's speaker to you. Today, Dr. Candice Mills, who is a professor and cognitive developmental psychologist at the University of Texas at Dallas, where she directs the Think Lab. The Think Lab focuses on questions related to how children and adults learn from others. Today, she's going to be speaking to us about research examining children's ability to evaluate claims across development. And so with that, I will hand it over to you, Dr. Mills.
Thank you. Thank you all for having me here. I was just telling Al that I appreciate that there's some complexities with Zoom and Teams for education, but one of the benefits has been that we can now have conversations across places where it would have been harder to connect. So I'm thankful for that opportunity. I'm trying to get my screen set up so that I can see you all and also see my notes. So let's make sure this is working. Okay. All right. So as Al mentioned, I'm really interested in how kids learn from others. And there are many things that we can learn through observation, right? So in looking at these two balls, I can take a look at their shape and I can compare them to one another, and I can easily recognize which ball is larger than the other. But there's a lot of other things where we need to depend on knowledge from other people to make sense of the world. So take, for instance, the shape of the Earth. It looks flat to me, especially walking outside in Texas, but in reality, we know that it's spherical. But if you think about how we know that it's spherical, it's based on what we've heard from other people, right? Enough other people have said that it's spherical that we believe it. Take something like germs. We see the effects of germs, but whether germs exist or magical spells cause illness, or there's imbalance of humors, we rely again on information from other sources to be able to understand what makes sense, unless we become experts in those areas ourselves. Even in reflecting about historical figures like Alexander Hamilton, I really enjoyed the musical when it came out, but I was thinking about how do I recognize that Alexander Hamilton was a real being as opposed to just a fictional character? Again, it's relying on knowledge from other people. And even for fictional characters like Santa Claus, we have to take information from others to construct our knowledge. There's certain things we learn firsthand through observation, and other things that we take a combination of our observation and what people tell us to make sense of our worlds. Now, imagine that you're a child and you're trying to make sense of your world, and you're having to learn so much about the world from other people. There's different perspectives on how kids make sense of their worlds, but a common theme is this assumption that kids are gullible. So this quote by Daniel Gilbert: children are especially credulous, especially gullible, especially prone toward acceptance and belief, as if they accepted as effortlessly as they comprehended, but had yet to master the intricacies of doubt. There's this other quote that takes it even further by Richard Dawkins. With so many mind bytes to be downloaded, so many mental codons to be replicated, it is no wonder that child brains are gullible, open to almost any suggestion, vulnerable to subversion, easy prey to moody Scientologists and nuns. This perspective held by both these researchers is that children are trusting almost everything they hear. They're very gullible because they have so much to learn. It makes sense for them to trust most things they hear. And there is some sense to these perspectives. What I'm interested in is, when are children skeptical? When do they hear a claim from a source or hear the claim itself and ask questions about whether or not they should trust it, or whether or not it makes sense, or whether it's missing information? So today I'm going to walk through 3 different lines of work related to what we understand about children's skepticism. I'll start off by talking about some research during the elementary school years, and I'll turn next to talking about some examples from the preschool years. And then we'll spend some time talking about Santa Claus as a case study for skepticism. And I'll describe these each in turn when we get to them. So I'll begin with this idea of what do we know about how elementary school age children can be skeptical. And I feel like the easiest way to start thinking about this question is to walk through examples of specific instances where we think skepticism might be merited and what we see with children. So let's take the case of objectivity. There are times where we rely on people to serve as judges to make decisions. And often we want those judges to be objective. I think the definition of judge, right? We want them to be objective. We want them to focus on the facts of the case and not be swayed by personal biases or deals with other people or anything like that. We want them to focus on the information itself. We may have disagreements sometimes as adults when we're thinking about issues with the Supreme Court, for instance, whether we think judges might be biased or whether they're being objective. Do children understand the possibility that a judge could be biased, that we should be skeptical about their decision-making? It's hard to ask kids about things like the Supreme Court, but we can ask them about topics that might be closer to home, like contests. And so in the work I'm about to mention, and I'll just say in big picture, often we'll do things like present kids with stories or simple contrasts or things that we can control to ask kids to make judgments, either evaluate claims or evaluate people as sources or to choose whose source they prefer more. It allows us to control a lot of the aspects of the studies to get a better sense of what they understand about these different perspectives. So in one set of studies, we wanted to see what do kids understand about bias. So imagine that you're trying to figure out how accurate a judge would be at deciding who won a contest. So you're talking about this with children, and you present them with a mom whose child is in the class that she's judging. I'm going to call her the connected judge. You can imagine there's times where there's a mom or a friend or a teacher who is personally connected to somebody that's in a contest versus a mom who doesn't have a child in the class. As adults, our intuition may be that the neutral judge would probably be more likely to make accurate decisions than a connected judge, that the connected judge might be biased in some circumstances towards their own child or towards children they know. For this study, we worked with adults and children from kindergarten through 8th grade. They were trained on a scale for rating how good a judge will be. And I'll walk you through the results for this study first and then walk you through some follow-up research. So I'm going to show you a graph. On the y-axis is a scale from 1 to 5, where 5 means you think this judge would be really, really accurate. 1 means you think that judge wouldn't be accurate at all. And 3 means like sort of accurate. The gray bars are the neutral judge. So this is the mom who doesn't know anybody in class, or the teacher who doesn't know anybody in class, or the friend who doesn't know anybody in class. The connected judge is somebody who has that personal connection. So we can focus on the older kids and adults first to see the clear contrasts. So adults through 4th graders rated the neutral judge as being more likely to be accurate than the connected judge. They were prepared for the possibility of bias in those situations by around 4th grade, about age 10 or so. 2nd graders, it was very, what we not eloquently call mushy data, in that about half the 2nd graders looked like the older kids and half didn't. And then our kindergartners showed the opposite preference. So they thought that the person with the personal connection would be able to be a more accurate judge. The mom who has a child in the class would be a more accurate judge at deciding which art is the best than the mom who doesn't have a kid in the class. So this was rating each judge separately, not doing comparison. So one of the things we were interested in is how do people pay attention to context when thinking about the possibility of bias? So take something like an art contest. An art contest, especially at the level of elementary school art, is more likely to, well, more subjective, we'll say, right? There's more room for bias in how you're interpreting the stuff that you see in an art contest. Contrast that with something like a spelling contest. With spelling contests, someone stands in front of a group and they spell out the word that they're given, and then they're either right or wrong. And if they miss a letter, then they are out, right? We understand that something like spelling or a math contest or even a running race, there's a more clear definition of who's going to win, like what the criteria are for winning, than for something like an art contest or a dance contest, for instance. So we presented kids with these basically different kinds of contests and looked to see how they rated the different judges. I will walk you through this data. It's the same sort of scale as what I've mentioned before, but now it has the information for both the subjective contest and the objective contest in it. So the striped lines are for the subjective contest. The solid bars are for the objective ones. And let's focus on the adults first, because that's the easiest to see visually. If you look at the solid bars, that's for the objective contest, like a spelling contest. People still think the person who's neutral will be more accurate than the person who has potential of bias. But if you look at the subjective contests, I'm making the waves in the air like you can see what I'm pointing to in the graph, but you know what I mean. There's a bigger difference for the subjective contest between the two judges. So in other words, for the adults, they are more concerned about bias, rating that connected judge lower for the subjective contest than for the objective ones. We see a similar sort of pattern with the 8th graders. So these kids are around 14. They showed some distinction between the context type. We did not see this for the 4th graders or 6th graders. They were basically not distinguishing between the contexts. The kindergartners were also not distinguishing between the contexts. They just always thought the connected judge was going to be better. So in terms of what do children understand about objectivity, we're seeing signs that kindergartners, these younger kids, age 5, 6 or so, have a preference for people with personal connections. The 4th graders and older children recognize the possibility that people's personal relationships could bias their decisions. And by the time they get later into junior high, middle school, they're better at coordinating context information when deciding who to trust, whether or not to trust them. I don't think this is a sign that kindergartners are being gullible. I think this is a sign that kindergartners are weighing the information differently. To a kindergartner, a 5-year-old, when we would ask them, how did you make this decision? They would say things like, well, she knows the people, and so she'll pay more attention. Like they would come up for reasons why she would be doing a better job than the person who didn't know everybody's names, for instance. Whereas the older kids were much more likely to talk about, oh, but she might choose her own child or choose her child's best friend. They are providing reasoning for their decisions, in other words. We've asked some other questions about skepticism during the elementary school years, and I'll highlight a few of those findings. A lot of our work has focused on what do kids recognize about the qualities of sources that are providing claims. Should we trust their claims? Are they going to make good decisions based on their expertise or their access to information or things like that? One of our findings has been that kindergartners tend to trust people's claims that are made in their own self-interest, more so than older kids. So again, as kids get older into elementary school, they're more able to recognize that just because someone wants something to be true, like I am the best runner, or I'm the best swimmer, or I have the best art, doesn't mean that that's actually true. And so older kids will show some skepticism towards those sorts of claims, whereas the kindergartners may be more likely to say, yeah, sure, they want to be the best, so they probably really are the best. That said, even these young kindergartners can recognize that there are some things that are important for making good decisions. One of our studies, we had presented kids with sets of judges that had different characteristics. So for instance, there might be a judge who can't hear anything because they're wearing headphones, or a judge who can't see anything because they have a blindfold on. The basic big idea is that kids would pay attention to what sense somebody had when thinking about who would be a better judge. So if they can't hear, they shouldn't be a judge for a singing contest. If they can't see, they shouldn't be a judge for something that involves something that they should be able to see. So they're not choosing at random. They are attending to some information when deciding whether or not to trust someone's judgments. So to us, this is a sign of selective cynicism, selective skepticism. They're weighing information when making their decisions. In general, as they get further into the middle school years, they seem better at recognizing how bias can vary depending on the situation. And we've also tried to understand more about individual differences in kids' ability to recognize bias. We found that kids who score better on general intelligence tests, as well as kids who have better social cognitive skills, like perspective taking skills, seem to be better at detecting when a decision might be biased, when a self-report might be biased, or when somebody might be making a persuasive claim that might be misleading in some way. So it's not just development that seems to be relating to how kids are doing at recognizing these different kinds of claims. It also seems to be their smarts in terms of regular intelligence, but also their social smarts in affecting their decision making. A lot of the work I've talked about so far has focused on how kids are evaluating people as sources, but I also want to say that kids sometimes evaluate the content of the claims that they encounter. So even a toddler will correct you if you call something the wrong name. Like if I hold up something like this and I say it's a banana, the toddler will be like, ha, 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 no. So they can recognize that sometimes people will make incorrect claims. It gets harder when they have less of their own knowledge to use to judge claims and have to look for information in the content itself. So I'll give you an example of this. In one of our series of studies, we talked to kids about animals that are usually pretty unfamiliar to them. So this is a colugo at the bottom of the screen. A colugo is an animal that can use their skin flaps to travel from one place to another. In reality, if you look at the mechanistic explanation, what they do is they use their skin flaps to basically catch air and they glide from treetop to treetop. In one of our studies, we presented kids with explanations like that and explanations like this circular explanation. Their skin flaps help them to move from one place to another. That explanation is not really going beyond the question. It's basically repeating the information in the question. It's not helping them to get to the answer to the question, take a step further or anything like that. So in theory, kids should reject that kind of circular explanation as being not helpful. We've done different studies to try to understand how kids evaluate explanation quality, like just the quality. So we keep the person who's saying it controlled as somebody fairly neutral, and they're looking to evaluate the whether or not they think the claim makes sense. And we've also looked at how it relates to their learning behaviors. And I'll highlight a few things from this work. One of the things is that kindergartners, so those 5 and 6-year-olds, do better at recognizing circular explanations when they're in contrast with a good one. So basically, oh, well, when you compare this good one to that circular explanation, I can see that the circular explanation isn't very helpful. They can still sometimes recognize circular explanations on their own, and we're trying to follow up more on why they can, what helps them to be better at doing this. But that contrast is at least one factor that helps them to recognize when some information is not helpful. We've also found that kids who recognize weak explanations are more likely to follow up with those to try to fill gaps in their knowledge, basically. So that ability to recognize that you've been given an explanation that's bad, and if it sparks some interest to figure out, well, why is it bad? What is the actual answer? Then they will sometimes engage in behaviors to try to fill the gaps in their knowledge. So this is another reason I think that the ability to be skeptical in some cases is helpful, because if you recognize that you've gotten a weak explanation, you might be more likely to engage in learning to try to fill the gaps in your knowledge, as opposed to if you just accept everything as being fine. All right, so I want to turn now to talking about what we know about skepticism during the preschool years, highlighting a few different findings. When we talk about preschoolers, we're thinking about 3 and 4-year-olds, sometimes 5. The research tends to focus more on varying the characteristics of the source as opposed to characteristics of the claim. So in other words, if you have a person making a claim, you could ask kids to contrast 2 different types of people with 2 different types of skill sets. I'll give you some examples, or you can give them claims that differ in 2 different ways and see what they notice. If you focus on presenting them with people who have different kinds of characteristics, it's basically easier for preschoolers to do as opposed to the verbally laden kinds of tasks that you might have for evaluating explanations. We know from past research that young children can recognize that age and experience are information that's helpful for making more accurate claims. So 4-year-olds understand that adults know more than themselves. Younger children tend to know less than themselves. They understand that an adult might be more likely to give them helpful information about some topics like science, and a child might be more likely to give them helpful information about other topics like video games. So they don't treat all sources the same, which is, again, some signs of them being selectively skeptical. They can also distinguish in some cases between sources who've been reliable in the past versus sources who aren't reliable in the past. So if they're presented with 2 different informants, that's usually what the characters are called in these studies, and the informants show a history of either always being right or always being wrong, then they'll avoid talking to the wrong one in the future. I think of this as in a personal anecdote. Whenever my dad and I used to play playing cards when I was a kid, at the end, he would say, "Do you want to play 52 pickup?" And I would say, at first, I would say, "Sure." And he would take the 52 cards. Have any of you dealt with this before? He would take the cards and then skew them all over the floor. And then 52 pickup was me picking up all the 52 cards. And so I learned that when it came to playing cards, he was not reliable for how we would interact with the cleanup after cards. And so I did not play with him with cards unless it was very clear that I was not going to do the cleaning up at the end. So our history of experiences with people can influence whether or not we want to continue going to them for different information. Another thing that can vary between sources is their expertise, right? So different people know different things. And there's some really cute research that's been done by other researchers finding that even 3-year-olds can understand that, for instance, doctors know different things than car mechanics. And by later in preschool, they can attribute the different kinds of knowledge to these different sources. So if they want to know more about how to help an animal that's sick, they would go to a doctor over a car mechanic. Really little kids can understand that kind of distinction. The reason why for these studies they use mechanics versus biology is that these are different kinds of domains of knowledge. Biology tends to focus on living things and the processes there, and mechanics focus on artifacts and machines and how those work. And so the distinction there, even if they weren't necessarily as familiar with car mechanic as doctor, the distinction there made sense to them. And this is something you can see even in 4- and 5-year-olds understanding to some extent. Importantly, as I mentioned before, not all sources are equally reliable. And so we have done some research to try to understand more about at what points will they pay attention to the content of the claims, or when are they evaluating the sources? If they're presented with sources that have different characteristics, what do they actually pay attention to? And so I'll highlight one of these studies that we did. We were interested in how kids pay attention to expertise against other kinds of characteristics. So if you have a question about your health, you should probably go to your doctor than your car mechanic. But what if your doctor is a jerk? You should probably still go to your doctor, or maybe try to find a new doctor that's not a jerk, right? If it's a health kind of question. And so we're interested in something like that with this study. We presented kids with a girl named Sally, and Sally found a bunch of stuff she didn't know the names for. We presented them with twins and offered to help the name of the objects. This is actually the dad of one of my former graduate students that was a model for our studies. And so one of them was a bicycle expert, one of them was an eagle expert. Again, we have a mechanics expert, basically, and an animal expert, like biology expert. And then the experts were described. So something like, this guy knows all about bicycles. He knows how to fix them when they break, what they're made of, and how the brakes work. He knows all sorts of things about bicycles. And I'll kind of briefly go through the methods and what we found to really focus more on the findings in the interest of time. So we presented 4- and 5-year-olds, and in one study 3-year-olds, I think, with different kinds of items. We had vehicle items, bird items, neutral items. So I found something to warm car seats. I found something to warm chicken eggs, or I found something to warm cold hands, which wasn't really clearly related to bicycles or eagles. And we would ask them questions like, okay, here's what this person said. Here's what this other person said. Point to the person who you think knows more about how to warm car seats, or evaluate this person's claim. I'll kind of focus on the main findings from this first study. Even 3-year-olds could recognize that the different experts were more likely to be able to know the answers to their questions. They sorted the eagle-related questions with the eagle expert and the bicycle-related questions with the bicycle expert. At age 3, pretty good. Then we decided to get tricky, as I mentioned before. What if that expert is mean? How much they get swayed by this other information when they're deciding whose claims to trust. And so we would provide this person's expertise. Like I mentioned before, he knows all sorts of things about bicycles. He's also very mean. He steals things from his friends and family. He refuses to share, and he doesn't care about people's feelings. And the opposite sort of framing for the nice person. Importantly, both of these characters were experts. Their expertise covered different domains. And we were interested to see which expert they would go to given different kinds of questions. We've done a few different follow-up studies on this, but the main basic finding is that meanness can matter for preschool age children. So children prefer the nice expert more often than chance, and they prefer the mean expert less often than chance. And by expert, I mean they are supposed to be choosing the bike expert because he knows about bikes, but they choose the eagle expert instead to answer their questions about bikes. In other words, in some cases, kids are persuaded by niceness and meanness over the expertise in answering the questions. In general, we've done a lot of different follow-up studies related to what preschoolers understand about evaluating claims, and there's others in the field that have done these as well. There are plenty of examples of preschoolers showing some sort of selective skepticism. They are doubting some claims based on past history, as I mentioned before, or expertise, or other kinds of things. If you're just showing them one factor to pay attention to, they can do pretty darn good, all things considered. As you start to give them multiple factors to pay attention to, they sometimes weigh information differently than we might as adults. And again, they have their reasons for doing so. So with the mean expert study, some of the kids would report, well, why would we ask, basically saying, why would we ask questions to this guy? He's not going to answer my question anyway. I'm not going to, why not try the other one just in case they might know the answer. We tried different ways of following up on this to see, well, what if they know this person will definitely answer their question? And they still are often swayed more towards something like niceness. We can encourage them in the way that we phrase questions to focus more on expertise. But it's good to be mindful that how friendly someone is a factor that kids will sometimes use in deciding whether or not to trust their claims. The last section I want to talk about is studying Santa as a case study. So we've talked about how kids can be skeptical in some situations. Santa is a really interesting example of how we provide a lot of information to try to encourage kids to believe in Santa, and yet at some point kids become skeptical, right? So in the US, 40 to 80% of kids believe in Santa Claus as a real character. Depending on what age group you get, you obviously are going to find different sort of percentages of belief. Interestingly, parents try really hard often to get their kids to believe in Santa, right? There's a lot of effort that can be spent to promote Santa beliefs, from taking kids to the mall to see Santa. There's interactions you can do. Even during the height of COVID, you could have a Zoom call with Santa Claus. There's been some cute comics that have come out related to how we handle Santa that's different than how we handle other things. So this example, how I talk to my kid for the first 11 months of the year. See, the way we learn about and make discoveries about our world is called the scientific method. And then how I talk to my kids in December, how does Santa's reindeer fly? Gosh, I don't know. I guess it must be magic. So there's a different approach we might take to dealing with some fantastical characters that kids are having to sort through and deciding what they think. In some ways, if you think about it, it's easier for kids to believe in Santa. Santa believes gives everyone presents on Christmas night with his magic, versus to deny Santa's existence. Because of, okay, to believe that Santa's not a real being, you have to believe that he's made up by corporations to sell stuff, maybe, and it's like a conspiracy to make all kids believe, and that people actually just pretend to be Santa. The cookies have to be eaten. In other words, there are a lot of factors that can encourage kids to believe in Santa, both in terms of what people are saying to them, and then in terms of the evidence that kids are getting from others. So we know that kids tend to transition to skepticism at some point. Understanding more about the process by which they become skeptical, what sort of factors are influencing their skepticism, and what those outcomes are, may shed light into more broadly how kids develop as skeptical thinkers. So for this set of research, we looked at both the processes and aftermath of becoming skeptical about Santa. So by process, I mean that there's different paths that kids could take to recognize that Santa is not real. One is scientific reasoning, that children's understanding of the world, including their biological knowledge and their understanding of physics, shows that Santa goes against the reality of the physical world and therefore must be imaginary. A classic example of this is, well, how does Santa get around the world all in one night? That doesn't really make any sense logically because there's so many houses that are out there. It doesn't follow the rules of physics that he could travel around that much. So in some cases, kids might use scientific reasoning to come to this decision. In other cases, they may use testimony, either direct or indirect. So by testimony, I mean claims from other people, conversations with peers, overhearing things that might lead them to become skeptical about Santa. And then in some cases, they might gather evidence that's separate from both these. So for instance, they might see the wrapping paper that Santa uses is in mom's closet, or they notice that the tags on the gifts look like dad's handwriting, that they could use those sorts of observations to recognize that it's not possible for Santa to be real. We were also interested in the aftermath, just for our own curiosity, really, as well as trying to understand how this fits with the process of becoming skeptical. So in other words, are there different paths that lead to skepticism that may lead to more difficult aftermath? So I think anecdotally, we've probably all heard of stories of people being upset by hearing the truth about Santa. And to understand more about what path to skepticism leads to less suffering, so to speak, might be informative to families as they're thinking about how they want to manage the Santa myth themselves. So for these studies, we worked with children and adults. So with children, we did Zoom in-person interviews. We made sure the parents confirmed the disbelief before the interview. And then we also had the first question of the interview to make sure, what do kids believe about Santa? And if they still believe Santa was real, then we stopped the interview. So we broke no hearts during this interview. We asked kids questions about when they became doubtful about Santa, how they figured out that Santa wasn't real, what made them sure, if they ever hid their disbelief, things like that, but also how they felt about it and if they would celebrate Santa themselves with their own kids one day. We also did a second study that I'll talk about more in a few minutes. Same sort of basic setup, except we could go into a little bit more detail about the aspects of aftermath that we might not feel comfortable talking about with kids. And I'll walk you through that in a minute. So for the Santa study with kids, first study, we interviewed kids between the ages of 6 to 17 about their experience of becoming skeptical. For most, they just become skeptical within the last 6 months. There are a few people that were a few years, but it was still a relatively short period of time compared to when you all think back to your experiences around Santa if you had them as a child. So we found that the mean age of doubting was around, they reported around 6.8, of disbelief around 7.7. This is consistent with research from the 70s and 80s and 90s about how kids become skeptical about Santa. It seems like it's often roughly between ages 7 and 8 historically. There's not that many studies about this experience, but this finding fits with some past research. But there's also a wide range of variability. So some really never bought the Santa myth that much. Others became skeptical much, much later. And we'll come back to this point later. We also coded for that process piece. So we know much less from past research about how kids actually feel like they became skeptical, what contributed to that. And so we coded all of their explanations for different characteristics. And I'll give you examples of each and share with you what the percentage of kids were that reported this as a path. For scientific reasoning, an example is we took a trip to New Zealand, and then I realized how big the real world really was, and I thought it was very unreasonable that Santa could fly around to every person's house in just 24 hours. So only 13% reported scientific reasoning as a path. For testimony, I asked my mom if he was real, and she printed out something from Pinterest or something saying that Santa isn't real. About 62% of our participants said that. And then we also had this experience category where they could say things, because every time we could see our mom putting out presents and we could tell, they could talk more about these sorts of observations that weren't involving scientific reasoning, that were just involving observations somehow that led them to some skepticism. You'll note these percentages add up to more than 100, and that's because there were times where kids might mention two things. So they might mention experience along with testimony, or testimony along with some scientific reasoning. It was sometimes just one path, but a number of kids did mention multiple paths towards skepticism. We also tried to code for how gradually these shifts happened. It's a little bit tricky with younger kids because they're not so good at articulating how long things take. Their perceptions of time, particularly for the youngest kids, aren't great. But a good number of them reported that this didn't happen abruptly, that it happened somehow gradually. When it comes to the aftermath, we noted that about a little over a third of kids reported feeling sad when they found out that Santa wasn't real. But I want to highlight that we had a lot of mixed feelings and confused or surprised kinds of comments. And then check out all the happy kids. There were 36% of kids who reported being happy when they found out that Santa wasn't real. I was initially surprised by this, but when we looked at their explanations, they would say things like, I thought something strange was happening and it felt good to figure it out. Or I felt happy and to realize that I was right about it. So they might have had some skepticism to begin with, and the confirmation made them feel happy to figure it out. Or they were happy that they were still getting Santa's gifts, even though that he wasn't a real character, a real person. In terms of what we know about predicting the aftermath, I'll just be really brief. There were no clear relation between if it was gradual or abrupt and the age of discovery, no clear relationship between gradual and age and their trust. But we also measured how much parents reported promoting Santa. There was a list of about 13 items they could check off whether or not they engage in them, from things like going to see the Santa at the shopping mall, to reading books about Santa, to watching movies about Santa, to making cookies for Santa, and so on. Parents who reported higher level of Santa promotion had kids who learned the truth about Santa later, and had kids who were more likely to report some negative emotions after finding out the truth. So I'll put a little pin in that idea because we'll come back to it in a minute. We also had asked kids if they would teach their own kids about Santa. Now, this is a super weird question to ask a 9-year-old, right? When you're a grown-up, are you going to tell your kids about Santa? But we wanted to see what they thought, if they wanted to keep the Santa tradition on for themselves. And a good number of them said yes or maybe. The ones who said maybe were sometimes like, I don't know if I'm going to have kids. I'm too young to know that. There was only a small percentage of the kids who said no, that they wouldn't. I'll highlight a couple things here in terms of how kids were becoming skeptical. It was a bit of testimony, a bit of experience, mostly more testimony than experience, less scientific reasoning than I had personally expected. Some sadness, but also some happiness that the kids were feeling, and almost all planned to celebrate Santa with their own kids. But a big issue with this kind of study is we're asking kids about their perspective of becoming to skepticism, and kids don't always tell their parents when they become skeptical about Santa. It was hard to recruit participants for this study because so many people would say, I actually don't know if my kid still believes, and if they still believe, I don't want to ruin it. And there were a few kids who also interviewed with their parents nearby, and so they may have had some discomfort admitting if they had any negative feelings about the experience. So for our next study, we actually worked with adults, and we asked adults to reflect on their own perspectives on becoming skeptical about Santa. So we worked with people who were as young as 18, as old as 76, meaning we had our 76-year-olds looking back over 60 years of their life, right, to think about how they became skeptical about Santa. It was a pretty educated sample who filled out this survey. And we asked them the same sort of questions as we did for kids, how they became skeptical about Santa and what the aftermath was like. And so I'll focus on the process first, and then we'll get into the aftermath real quick. So they reported the average age of belief around 8.5. There was some variation. I should have taken out the range of 0 because it was really a range of like 4 or so to 13. There was a couple outliers there that I ended up removing from the sample. We asked people if they remembered anything about their journey to no longer believing in Santa. So you can remember how you figured out that Santa wasn't real, or how you felt when you realized Santa was real or was not real, or both or neither, right? So you could remember parts of the experience, not all of them. The majority of our participants did remember something about their journey. And so I'll walk you through a few things about this. In terms of what they remember about their journey, we found very similar results to what we did for the kids. The majority of participants, 68%, reported testimony as being their primary path. So hearing from a friend or confirming it from their teacher or from their parent. And a subset figured out through experience, those observations of packaging or wrapping paper or finding the presents in the trunk of the car or things like that. And a smaller subset remembered it through, or figured out through scientific reasoning. Occasionally rituals and morals will also mention. I'll just mention that briefly. This was either thinking about how the Santa Claus ritual was different from different households, or wondering why one person might get better presents than another person, or why did the kids from this religion not celebrate Santa? Those sorts of differences came up more from our adult participants. We didn't see that at all with our child participants. We also asked them, from whom did you find out who Santa was not real? And a good number of them said on their own, but they also found out from friends and peers, like 26% of the time. And then occasionally they didn't remember. Many of them reported gradual discovery, although there were quite a few that didn't remember or reported abrupt discovery. So a mixture, I guess, more so than with the younger kids. And then we asked them about how they felt after they found out that Santa wasn't real. And for this, again, we found sadness as being the most common emotion. We found a mixture of other emotions like frustration or mixed feelings, and some who didn't remember again. The duration varied quite a bit. And so for our adults, we could get more precise information about how long they felt that way afterwards. Some would report just like an hour. They felt sad for just a little while. Some reported things like kind of forever. So having stronger impact from this sort of discovery. Only a small percentage of people mentioned happiness in this sample, which is not what we saw with the kids, suggesting that it's important when we're doing studies on things like this, that we get perspectives, different kinds of perspectives, to get a better sense of what's going on. A few more things I wanted to mention about this adult data. We asked them if they would teach their own kids about Santa. Of those who planned on having kids or do already have kids, 89% or so said yes, that they were. And they shared things like, I think allowing children to experience the joy of myth and legend and story is a beautiful thing. I think that when handled correctly, the story of Santa can be incredibly exciting for young children. I'm picking yes, but I'm honestly not sure. I feel obligated by social norms to tell my kids about Santa, so they have the magical experience for their kids. It seems nice and cute to have kids believe in Santa, but I don't know if I can come to terms with lying just yet. So that person was leaning yes, but still unsure. Of the people who said no, explicitly no, I'm not doing it, there were different reasons that people came up with. I will teach them that some people believe it, but it's not real, and that Jesus is real, and that's why we celebrate. I don't think it's necessary to create this belief for it to eventually lead to disappointment, because it's not helpful for their future ability to question and think logically. I also think it's weird to believe in an old guy who knows everything about you and decides to give out rewards or coal as a result. So these are kind of snapshots at how people were thinking about how they wanted to move forward with the Santa myth. I'll briefly highlight that the experiences with coming to disbelieve Santa also related to some disbelief towards other fictional characters like Tooth Fairy and Easter Bunny in some ways. And in a small number of participants, like 11% of the participants or so, they reported asking some questions about aspects of their religious stories or religious figures as a result of coming to hear different things about Santa Claus. Also similar to the trial data, adults who reported receiving higher levels of Santa promotion, I shouldn't say had shit on here. Adults who reported receiving higher levels of Santa promotion were more likely to learn the truth about Santa later and were more likely to report negative emotions. So we're seeing that connection with the child data, that the amount that Santa was promoted at home affected how long they believed and how they felt when they believed, or stopped believing rather. So big picture for the Santa study in particular. When it comes to becoming skeptical about Santa, testimony played a pretty big role in that. And testimony plays a pretty big role in kids forming beliefs about Santa too, right? They hear about Santa from other people, but they also do get experiences from firsthand observation about Santa as well. And so it's interesting to see that testimony may play a big role in coming to believe in Santa and also can play a role in that disbelief as well. This role for parent promotion in particular is interesting to think about. This idea that parents can celebrate Santa and the kids can have a wonderful time, but there may be a level of promotion that may be leading to more negativity once kids actually discover the truth. That should be good for people to think about. Still need more follow-up work to understand more about this. And I think it's important to note that the vast majority of people still plan to teach their kids about Santa. So it's not like this experience is crushing them forever. They like it. So even if they've become skeptical, they're finding some things that they really appreciate about the Santa myth and moving forward. So stepping back a bit, we had started off this discussion with this idea that children are especially credulous, especially gullible, especially prone towards acceptance of belief, as if they accepted as effortlessly as they comprehended, but had yet to master the intricacies of doubt. I think these different studies give us a sense that even during the preschool years, children can show some signs of selective skepticism. They can weigh some information to decide who to trust. They're not trusting every single thing they hear, because if they did, they wouldn't differentiate between different kinds of sources or different kinds of content. They are paying attention to content to some extent. They are paying attention to the sources to some extent. As children develop, they are better at evaluating the quality of the claims they encounter and better at recognizing what dimensions are relevant for deciding what to trust and what to doubt. We also think there's this consistent finding that we need to think about across studies where kids can be particularly influenced by the preponderance of evidence from otherwise reliable sources. So if they have experience with a source being reliable in the past, there may be an easier default to trust that source. If they're hearing a lot of people talking about Santa, it's easy to believe Santa is real. I don't think of those examples as being gullible. I think those are examples of them making sense of the information that they're provided. And when lots of information points in the same direction, it makes sense to go in that direction and follow it along. We'll stop there. I will mention that I thank my collaborators, my students, and our funding agencies, and I am happy to talk about any of these studies with you. I'll stop my screen sharing now so I can see you all. Thank you.